But they left with something they didn't expect, a lesson that no menu could offer. A lesson about humility, about patience, about grace. A plate shattered, but something else was built in its place, understanding. Before we talk about your place in that lesson, ask yourself, how do you react when someone makes a mistake around you? Do you let frustration take the lead, or do you pause long enough to remember that you've stumbled too? Compassion doesn't mean ignoring responsibility. It means recognizing humanity before judgment. It means understanding that mistakes don't define people. Responses do. The billionaire's wealth didn't make his reaction noble. His empathy did. And that's something anyone, anywhere, can choose. Whether you're a boss, a student, a parent, or a stranger on a crowded street, kindness is always within reach. Before we talk about what the story teaches, we should realize that it's not about perfection. No one is kind all the time. Everyone fails, everyone snaps, everyone forgets. But the point isn't to never fall short, it's to remember when we can, to reach for compassion instead of judgment. Because even one moment of grace can undo 1,000 moments of pain. A moment of kindness can heal unseen wounds. That night proved it. The billionaire didn't just forgive a mistake, he unknowingly healed a part of himself and gave hope to everyone watching. Before we talk about what you might take from this, picture the next time you're in a similar situation. When someone spills coffee, misses a deadline, or says the wrong thing, that will be your chance to do what he did, to choose calm over anger, to choose empathy over ego. You might never know how much it means. You might never see the impact. But kindness doesn't need witnesses to matter. It doesn't fade. It leaves echoes in places you'll never see. Before we talk about moving on, remember that life gives us countless small tests every day. Most of them are invisible. A rude comment, a delay, a clumsy mistake. These are all invitations, quiet chances to prove what kind of person we are. And each time we choose patience, we build something stronger inside ourselves. A character that isn't shaken by the world's noise. So maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the billionaire, not the waitress, but the reminder that kindness is our most enduring currency, one that never loses value no matter how much or little we have. Before we talk about the end of the night, imagine that quiet restaurant again. The lights still glowed. The broken plate was cleaned up. The guests finished their meals, but something invisible had changed. Everyone breathed a little deeper, spoke a little softer. The air felt lighter. That's what compassion does. It restores balance in places where pride once ruled. It softens hearts without anyone realizing it. It heals wounds no one else can see. And maybe that's the real takeaway. The next time you see someone stumble, whether it's a spilled plate or a moment of weakness, pause before you judge, because you might be looking at a reflection of yourself, just in a different moment of life. And choosing kindness could be the thing that saves not only them, but a forgotten part of you too. Before we end this story, take a moment to think, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have reacted with anger or with the same quiet compassion that Billionaire showed that night? Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest hearts. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of kindness today. Never know who's fighting a silent battle behind their smile. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen or experienced a moment like this? Your story might inspire someone else. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Because just like that night in the restaurant, a single act of kindness can change more than a moment. It can change a heart. For once, bring them closer. The air was thick with judgment, pity, and suspense. Somewhere a fork clinked softly as someone set it down. The music picked up again, but no one noticed. The waitress finally knelt, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the larger pieces. Her manager gestured impatiently for help. Her fingers brushed a shard of porcelain, and a small cut appeared on her skin. She didn't flinch. The pain was nothing compared to the fear tightening her chest. She just wanted to disappear. Before we talk about what changed everything, we have to pause here. In this suspended second, where the world had turned its eyes toward one woman's mistake and one man's silence. Because what happened next would not only define that night, it would redefine what everyone in that room believed about power, pride, and compassion. Before we talk about the words that came out of his mouth, we need to stay in the silence that came before them. The kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes time stretch until it almost stops. The restaurant had frozen in that uneasy pause, 100 eyes waiting for the same thing. Anger. Everyone expected it. Everyone knew it was coming. That's how power usually works. It strikes down, not sideways. The waitress was still on her knees, trembling, gathering broken pieces one by one. Her breathing was uneven, her face pale. The manager hovered nearby, half pleading, half panicking, ready to take the blame just to protect the restaurant's reputation. Across the table, guests exchanged awkward glances, their polite smiles fading into discomfort, and at the center of it all sat the billionaire, silent, motionless, unreadable. Before we talk about what he said, we have to notice how he looked at her. It wasn't the look of someone angry or insulted. It wasn't disgust or superiority. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in a world of suits and silk tablecloths. His eyes softened, his expression shifting in a way no one expected. It was as if the chaos around him had faded, leaving only her, a frightened woman with shaking hands and broken porcelain at her feet. He didn't shout. He didn't call for security, didn't demand compensation or apologies. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back, the faint scrape of its legs echoing through the stillness. Heads turned. The sound of movement, even that small, felt shocking in the quiet. Before we talk about what he did next, we need to understand what people were expecting. In that kind of setting, a man like him held unspoken authority. The smallest gesture from him could end a career, ruin a reputation, send ripples through every person working there. The power imbalance was so visible, it almost had a sound of its own. But he didn't stand up in anger. He stood in something that looked like empathy. He looked down at the shattered plates, then at her trembling hands, and something inside him shifted. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was something he'd buried long ago beneath layers of wealth and control. Whatever it was, it pulled him closer, not physically at first, but in presence, in energy, in humanity. Before we talk about the words that broke the silence, we have to see what happened when he moved. He didn't rush. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze steady but gentle. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he reached for his napkin, dabbed at the small stains on his sleeve, and smiled, not mockingly, not dismissively, but softly. The kind of smile that says, "It's okay," he spoke, and his voice wasn't the deep, commanding tone people expected. It was calm, low, almost fragile. "Don't worry," he said, each word cutting through the air like a whisper in a cathedral. "It's just a plate." Those 4 words hung. They're carrying more weight than a speech ever could. Before we talk about how people reacted, we have to feel the disbelief that filled the room. The manager froze mid-step, unsure whether he'd heard correctly. One of the billionaire's companions blinked, confused, as if waiting for a punchline. The waitress, still crouched on the floor, slowly lifted her head, unsure if he was speaking to her or someone else. He smiled again faintly, but genuinely this time. "You didn't hurt anyone," he continued softly. "That's what matters." The words were simple, but the tone behind them wasn't. It carried exhaustion, not the kind that comes from work, but the kind that comes from life. The kind that understands mistakes, not because of tolerance, but because of experience. Before we talk about the tears that followed, we have to understand why his voice trembled. Because somewhere inside that man, behind the perfectly tailored suit and the unshakable calm, there was a memory, a younger version of himself, perhaps standing in a similar place. A time when he had been the one who stumbled, who broke something, who was terrified of disappointing someone powerful. Maybe he remembered a time when no one had shown him kindness, when someone had humiliated him instead. Maybe this was his chance after all those years to rewrite that memory, not for himself, but for her. He leaned back in his chair, sighing quietly. Then, with a small motion that no one expected, he stood up. The room seemed to inhale all at once. The waitress immediately lowered her head again, whispering apologies that tumbled out like broken glass. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean, I swear. Please, I'll pay for it. I'll clean it." He stopped her with a single gesture, his hand raised gently, palm outward. "Please," he said softly, "don't say sorry for being human." Before we talk about the moment, his voice cracked. We have to see what those words did to her. She froze again, but this time not from fear. Something shifted inside her to a small, hesitant relief, like the first breath after nearly drowning. Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as if trying to hold them back. He glanced down at the broken porcelain on the floor and said, almost to himself, "I used to do this too. You know, drop things, break things. I was terrible at my first job." A small, rueful laugh escaped him, the kind that carries both humor and heartbreak. One of his companions tried to chuckle politely but stopped when he saw the man's face. Because now, the billionaire wasn't smiling anymore. His expression softened further, his eyes glistening with something rare. "I remember the night I thought I'd ruined everything," he said, his voice quieter now. Words trembling at the edges. "Someone yelled at me, told me I'd never make it. And for a long time, I believed them." Before we talk about the tears, we have to notice how he stopped speaking then, mid-sentence, mid-memory, as if realizing where he was. Or perhaps realizing how far he'd come from that scared boy he once was. He blinked, and the light caught the faint moisture in his eyes. The crowd didn't move. Even the waiters in the corner stopped pretending to clean. He took a breath, deep and steady, and looked at the waitress again. "You're doing your best," he said gently. "And that's all anyone can ask." Those words seemed to echo longer than they should have. The waitress didn't know what to do. Her hands hovered above the floor, clutching the napkin someone had handed her. The manager stood speechless, unsure whether to apologize again or to thank him. The billionaire knelt slightly, bending down enough to pick up one of the larger shards himself. The sound of glass against glass was delicate, almost reverent. The entire restaurant gasped quietly, not because of what had fallen, but because of what was rising. Humility. Before we talk about the hush that followed, we have to understand what that small gesture meant. In a world where people like him rarely touched anything broken, he was touching the fragments himself. It wasn't about helping her clean. It was about showing her and everyone else that no one was above kindness, that mistakes don't erase worth. When he stood again, there was a strange heaviness in his eyes. Not sorrow, but recognition. He looked around the room and saw every expression frozen between guilt and awe. Then he said quietly, "All of you, go on. Keep eating. It's fine." No one moved. The manager finally stepped forward, bowing slightly, mumbling apologies again. The billionaire nodded, dismissing him gently. "Accidents happen," he said simply. "Let's not make it worse by forgetting we're people." Before we talk about the tears that finally fell, we have to see how he took his seat again. Not as a man defending his pride, but as a man remembering what it means to be human. He dabbed at his sleeve one more time, exhaled slowly, and looked back at the waitress. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded quickly, though her eyes glistened. "Sir, I'm fine. I didn't mean," he interrupted again, this time with a faint smile. "Why?" "No, it's okay." Something inside him cracked open with those words. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was grief. His eyes lingered on the floor for a second too long, his jaw tightening before he looked away. When he finally blinked, a tear escaped quick, small, unplanned, or brushed it away almost immediately, pretending it wasn't there, but everyone saw it. And in that moment, no one saw a billionaire. They saw a man. Before we talk about how the room reacted, notice what didn't happen. No one clapped, no one whispered, no one moved. It was as if the entire place had turned into a chapel, and every heart in that room had bowed in silence. The waitress still knelt, her shoulders trembling now for a different reason, not from fear, but from the weight of unexpected kindness. The billionaire looked at her one last time and said quietly, "You remind me of someone. Someone who once dropped something too, and thought it was the end." His voice cracked again, softer now, barely a whisper. It wasn't. He reached into his pocket, took out a handkerchief, and placed it on the table beside her. Then, without another word, he sat down and gestured for the staff to continue serving. But the moment didn't end there. It lingered in the air, in every heartbeat, in every quiet tear that fell unnoticed. Before we move forward, we have to stay in that silence for just a moment longer. The silence that wasn't about shock anymore, but about understanding. Because for the first time that night, everyone in that room saw what true strength looked like. And it wasn't in power or wealth or control. 8. It was in the quiet mercy of a man who chose kindness when the world expected fury. Before we talk about the reason behind his unexpected reaction, we need to look deeper, far beyond that single moment in the restaurant. It's because what people saw that night wasn't just kindness. It was something rooted in years of buried pain, memories he rarely let anyone glimpse, and a past that had shaped the man behind the wealth, the power, and the perfect suit. Before we talk about the billionaire who didn't shout, didn't scold, and didn't walk away, we must talk about the boy he used to be, a boy who knew what it meant to be invisible. He wasn't born into luxury. His empire didn't fall into his hands by chance. There was a time when he stood behind counters just like hers, when he served tables with trembling hands and smiled through exhaustion. Because he couldn't afford to lose the job that paid for his family's next meal, he remembered those days too well, the cold nights when he'd walk home in worn-out shoes. The sting of humiliation when a customer yelled at him for something he didn't do. The ache of being treated as if his worth depended on how quickly he could clear a plate. Before he built towers that touched the sky, before the world called him sir or boss, he was that same struggling soul, surviving one shift at a time. So when that plate crashed onto the floor, when everyone gasped and turned toward the trembling waitress, time didn't just slow down for him. It pulled him backward. It took him to a small diner on the edge of town where a young version of himself once dropped a glass of water on a customer's expensive suit. He could still hear the echo of that man's voice, the shouting, the insults, the way everyone laughed. Remembered how small he felt, how hard it was to hold back tears while apologizing over and over. And he remembered the manager who didn't defend him, who told him later, if you can't handle this, you'll never make it anywhere. That memory became one of the many invisible scars. That built his drive to succeed. But it also built a quiet promise that if he ever found himself on the other side of that moment, he'd never treat someone the way he'd been treated. He would never let power erase the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to struggle. Before we talk about the tears that gathered in his eyes that night, we have to understand that they weren't just for the girl standing before him. They were for the boy he used to be, the boy who carried pain like a shadow, who fought for respect, who vowed to never forget how fragile dignity can be. She reminded him of his mother, too, the woman who used to come home after long shifts, her hands red from washing dishes, her back aching but her spirit unbroken. She taught him that kindness was not weakness, that gentleness was not something to hide. And now, standing in that elegant restaurant surrounded by glittering lights and polished marble, he saw her reflection in this nervous young woman who could barely hold her tears. He saw the same determination in her eyes, that quiet will to keep going, even when the world made her feel small. I saw the exhaustion behind her smile, the kind that comes from trying to do everything right and still falling short. And in that instant, it wasn't about the broken plate, the expensive suit, or the watching crowd. It was about a moment of recognition, one human being seeing another not as a servant, not as an employee, but as a mirror of something deeply familiar. Before we talk about his silence, we have to understand that it wasn't empty. It was filled with memories of nights he wished someone had shown him compassion. It was filled with the voices of those who once belittled him and the realization that he never wanted to become one of them. He thought about the people who had helped him when he least deserved it. The cafe owner who gave him a job despite his inexperience. The teacher who believed in him when no one else did. The stranger who once paid for his meal when he couldn't afford one. Their kindness didn't just change his circumstances. It shaped his soul. It became the quiet force behind every business he built, every charity he funded, every time he told his staff, "We lead with empathy, not ego." And now, fate had brought him full circle, from being the one who trembled to being the one who could choose how to respond. His wealth gave him power, but his past gave him perspective. He knew how easy it was to forget where you came from once you reached the top. But in that moment, surrounded by stunned silence and shattered porcelain, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like the boy who once stood in that same spot, waiting for someone to tell him it was okay. Before we talk about how his voice broke when he finally spoke, we must see what that crack in his voice really was. Not weakness, but release. It was the weight of years of struggle finding its way out through one act of grace. His tears weren't for the embarrassment or the spectacle. They were for the beauty of realizing that no matter how far he had come, compassion still lived within him. He didn't see her as clumsy or careless. He saw her as brave, still standing despite fear, still apologizing even when her voice trembled. He knew what courage looked like, because he had worn it once. He knew that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to look someone in the eye after you've made a mistake. Before we talk about why the entire room felt something they couldn't explain, we have to realize that empathy is contagious. When one person chooses kindness over anger, it softens everyone around them. The billionaire's silence spoke louder than any outburst could. His calmness made others uncomfortable at first, but then it humbled them. People who might have laughed suddenly lowered their heads. Those who were quick to judge found themselves questioning why they'd expected cruelty instead of compassion. He wasn't just showing mercy. He was teaching a lesson without saying a word. That no matter how high you climb, you never outgrow the need to be human. That true power isn't in how loud your voice is, but in how gently you use it. Before we talk about what he did next, it's important to understand what held him still: the flood of emotions. The collision of past and present, the deep ache of remembering what it felt like to be on the other side of someone's anger. He had every reason to react like the world expected him to. He could have shouted, demanded punishment, or walked out in disgust. But something inside him whispered, "Not this time. It's not this time," because he knew how much strength it takes to face humiliation with grace. Not this time, because he had promised himself years ago that if he ever became someone powerful, he'd use that power differently. Not this time, because maybe, just maybe, this was the universe's way of reminding him of who he truly was. He looked at her not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as a reflection of his own journey, and in that gaze something shifted. The room, the people, the noise, all of it faded. It was just the two of them, two stories intersecting for a reason neither of them could yet understand. Before we talk about how that night changed them both, we must see that this was never just about a broken plate. It was about broken pride, broken expectations, and the beauty of how kindness can fill the cracks. It was about the reminder that no matter how far life takes us, we all started somewhere humble, and sometimes it takes one simple accident to bring us back to that truth. It was about him realizing that empathy was his greatest wealth, something no amount of money could buy and no mistake could destroy. Before we talk about what happened after that quiet, tearful moment, we need to step back and look at the air that hung in the room, still heavy, almost sacred. No one moved at first. The sound of broken porcelain still echoed faintly in their ears, yet the tension that had filled the restaurant only moments ago had vanished. In its place was something else, something unspoken. Before we talk about the reactions, understand that people weren't just watching a billionaire and a waitress anymore. They were witnessing something raw, humanity stripped of status, stripped of ego. What had started as an accident had turned into a mirror, reflecting back at everyone in the room who they really were. When no one was watching, the waitress still stood frozen. Her cheeks were red, her hands trembling as she tried to pick up the shattered pieces on the floor, but she didn't need to. One of her fellow servers rushed forward, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "It's okay." Then another joined, kneeling beside her, helping her gather the pieces. Soon others followed, people who only minutes ago had been busy, stressed, or annoyed by the rush, now found themselves united by compassion. Before we talk about the billionaire's gesture, we have to notice how he stayed still for a few seconds longer, as if letting the silence settle inside him. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket, not to pull out his wallet, not yet, but to take out a simple white handkerchief. He stepped closer and, without a word, handed it to the waitress so she could wipe her tears. The gesture was so small that it could have gone unnoticed, but in that charged moment, it felt monumental.
Ow.
The guests watched in stunned quiet. A few of them had their hands pressed to their chests. Others exchanged soft, uneasy glances. Someone sniffled. Another reached for a napkin. A woman near the corner wiped her eyes, whispering to her friend, "Did you see that?" The man beside her nodded but couldn't in any words. Before we talk about what the billionaire did next, we need to understand that his power didn't come from money that night. It came from his stillness, from the way he refused to let anger win. He didn't demand a replacement suit. He didn't ask for compensation or make a scene. Instead, he called the restaurant manager over and said in a calm, steady voice, "No one here should ever lose their job over a mistake." The manager stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The billionaire continued, "Accidents happen, but dignity that should never be broken." A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked ashamed for the way they had gasped earlier. It was as if every person there had been reminded of something they'd forgotten, that kindness carries its own quiet authority. Before we talk about the waitress's emotions, we must imagine the rush of feelings inside her. The shock, the relief, the disbelief. Her throat ached from holding back tears. She had braced herself for humiliation, maybe even for losing her job. But instead, she found herself surrounded by warmth. Her coworkers whispered reassurance. The guests smiled softly at her. And the man she had feared most, the one she had accidentally spilled on, had treated her with grace. When he finally took out his wallet, it wasn't to flaunt his wealth, but to make a point. He placed a thick envelope on the counter and said quietly to the manager, "Use this to support your staff bonuses. Pairs whatever they need." Then, turning to the waitress, he added, "And take the rest of the night off. You've done enough." The entire staff stood still, not knowing whether to thank him or cry. The waitress's lips parted, but no words came out. She only nodded, clutching the handkerchief in her hand like it was something sacred. Before we talk about what this meant for her, think about the countless days that came before this one. Days filled with stress, exhaustion, and invisible effort. People rarely noticed her. Her name tag might as well have been her identity, not her personhood. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Not as a worker, not as a mistake, but as a human being worthy of respect. That one act of kindness did something no paycheck ever could. It gave her dignity back. The shame that had rushed through her veins moments ago melted into gratitude, and beneath that gratitude, something deeper bloomed. Hope. Hope that there were still good people in the world. Hope that even when life seems merciless, compassion still exists. Before we talk about what this meant for him, the billionaire, we have to understand that even he was changed that night. He had given money countless times before to charities, to foundations, to people who wrote him letters asking for help. But this felt different. This wasn't about giving. It was about connecting. It reminded him that behind every transaction, every handshake, and every employee badge, there was a beating heart, a story, a struggle. For the first time in a long while, he felt small again. Not in a belittling way, but in a grounding one. It's the kind of small that reminds you you're human, that you bleed and feel and make mistakes like everyone else. It's the kind of small that humbles you in the best way. He left the restaurant that night without fanfare. No reporters, no cameras, no announcement. Just quiet steps into the night air. But something within him had shifted, like the closing of a long and finished chapter. For years, he had worked to prove himself, to rise above his past. Yet standing in that restaurant, he realized he didn't need to rise above it. He needed to remember it, because it was his roots that made him capable of compassion, not his riches. Before we talk about how others were affected, we have to notice the subtle ripple that spread through the restaurant. The next morning, the staff came in with a different kind of energy. The same manager who used to bark orders softened his tone. The servers smiled more genuinely at guests. Even the guests who had witnessed the scene told others about it, not as gossip, but as a story of kindness worth repeating. The restaurant's culture began to shift. Small things changed first. A new policy that ensured mistakes wouldn't lead to immediate punishment. A suggestion box that encouraged staff to speak up. Free meals for employees after long shifts, all inspired by that one night. The billionaire's gesture became the quiet legend of that place. Regular customers would sometimes bring it up, and each time, the story grew softer, but more powerful. Did you know this is where a billionaire once comforted a waitress who spilled on him? It became more than a story. It became a reminder. Before we talk about the wider meaning, we have to see that every person in that room walked away carrying something invisible yet profound. For the guests, it was a renewed sense of empathy. Many of them found themselves rethinking how they treated people in service roles, the barista, the cleaner, the clerk. That one moment had peeled away a layer of indifference they didn't even realize they had built. For the staff, it became a lesson in unity. They realized that kindness wasn't something that only came from above. It could also start with them. They began watching out for each other more, stepping in when someone was overwhelmed, sharing small words of encouragement. And for the waitress, that night became a turning point. Weeks later, she'd tell her friends that the man she spilled on didn't just change her night, he changed her perspective. She stopped walking with her head down. She began to believe that her work mattered, that every act of service carried dignity. Before we talk about what this meant in the bigger picture, we should remember that not all stories of wealth end with compassion. Many end with pride, anger, or silence. But this one was different because it showed what power looks like when it's gentle. It wasn't about dominance or fear. It was about awareness, the ability to see humanity even in the smallest moment. For the billionaire, that night stayed with him longer than anyone imagined. In the weeks that followed, he revisited some of his company policies. He increased wages for lower-level employees, added wellness programs, and personally met with teams he'd never spoken to before. People wondered what had sparked the change, but he never told the story publicly. Some things, he believed, were meant to stay sacred, reminders that humility doesn't need an audience. Before we talk about how the world moved on, it's worth noting that the memory of that night never faded for those who were there. Even months later, guests who'd witnessed the scene said that something about it changed them. They didn't just remember the billionaire's name, they remembered the feeling in the room. That rare and fragile quiet that only true compassion creates. It lingered like a gentle echo, reminding them that sometimes the most powerful moments in life aren't the loud ones. They're the ones where someone chooses kindness when no one expects it. And so, while the restaurant went back to its usual rhythm, plates clinking, laughter returning, waiters hurrying between tables, the energy was never quite the same. Something sacred had touched the place. Something that couldn't be seen, only felt. Before we talk about anything else, we must understand that this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a ripple. One act of grace had moved through a room full of strangers and found its way into hearts that would carry it forward in quiet ways. Some through their words, some through their actions. Some through a simple pause the next time they faced someone's mistake. Remembering that empathy, like light, is most visible when the world feels dark. Before we talk about the lesson, that night left behind, we need to return for a moment to the silence that followed it. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from discomfort or fear. It was softer, warmer, filled with thought. Every person in that room, whether they realized it or not, carried something away from that scene, something that would whisper to them later, maybe days or weeks afterward, in the quiet corners of their own lives. Before we talk about the moral, let's think about what truly happened. A plate fell. A billionaire reacted with kindness instead of anger. And the world, at least for the people who saw it, changed a little. It wasn't a grand act of heroism. It wasn't something that would make headlines or spark debates online. It was simply one human being choosing compassion when he had every reason not to. Yet, that simplicity is what made it so powerful. Before we talk about the message behind it, it's worth asking, why did that moment touch everyone so deeply? Maybe because it reminded people of something they had forgotten, that kindness is not weakness, and gentleness is not fragility. In a world that often rewards pride, speed, and control, moments of softness stand out like light in a dark hallway. A moment of kindness can heal unseen wounds. It sounds simple, almost cliché, but it's true in ways we rarely notice. We never really know what someone else is carrying. The waitress that night wasn't just balancing plates. She was balancing exhaustion, fear, responsibility, maybe even the weight of a life that constantly tested her patience. And the billionaire wasn't just sitting there with wealth and power. He was sitting with memories of struggle, of hunger, of a time when his hands shook just like hers. Before we talk about how the story spread, think about how invisible struggles pass by us every day. The cashier who smiles, even though she's fighting tears. The driver who cuts someone off because he's late for a second job. It's a coworker who seems distracted but is really carrying the worry of a sick parent. We cross paths with hundreds of these small, hidden stories, and most of the time we never even notice. That's why compassion matters. It's not about fixing someone's life or changing the world overnight. It's about recognizing humanity. The quiet reminder that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you can't see. When the billionaire chose not to shout, when he offered a handkerchief instead of a harsh word, he didn't just comfort one person. He reminded everyone watching what it looks like to be human. Before we talk about judgment, imagine how quickly people usually respond when someone stumbles, a glare, a sigh, a whisper of criticism. It's almost instinctive. We're quick to notice mistakes, slower to notice effort. quick to assume carelessness, slower to imagine exhaustion. That's why the billionaire's reaction hits so deeply, because he did the opposite of what the world expects. Next time you see someone stumble, figuratively or literally, pause before you judge. You might not know what it took for that person to even show up that day. Maybe that mistake was the breaking point of 1,000 little struggles you can't see. But your kindness, even a small one, could be the thing that helps them breathe again. Before we talk about what this means for you, consider this. Compassion costs nothing. It doesn't require wealth, status, or power. You don't have to be a billionaire to give someone dignity. You don't need grand gestures to make a difference. Sometimes, it's as small as staying calm when someone else can't. Sometimes it's saying, "It's okay," when you could have said, "What's wrong with you?" The billionaire that night reminded everyone that kindness isn't a luxury, it's a choice. One we all have access to every single day. And it's often the simplest moments that echo the loudest. Because when someone expects anger and receives understanding instead, it creates a kind of silence that people never forget. Before we talk about how we apply this, let's think about what that night revealed about human nature. Most people want to be kind, but fear stops them. Fear of looking weak, of being taken advantage of breaking the unwritten rules that say, you must always appear strong. But true strength isn't in dominance, it's in restraint. It's in choosing empathy when your ego begs for pride. It's in staying gentle in a world that often celebrates hardness. The billionaire didn't lose authority by showing compassion, he gained respect, and that's something every person in that restaurant understood on a quiet, instinctive level. They saw that humility can carry more power than arrogance ever will. They saw that being kind doesn't mean you're soft, it means you're secure enough not to need cruelty. Before we talk about what this means beyond that night, imagine the ripple that single act created. The waitress would carry it home, telling her family how a man she feared had shown her grace. Her co-workers would remember it the next time a customer yelled. The guests would recall it the next time they were served by someone tired or clumsy. And even the billionaire himself would carry it forward, in boardrooms, in decisions, in how he spoke to people who worked for him. That's the real magic of compassion. It doesn't end with the person who receives it. It spreads quietly, invisibly, but powerfully. One act leads to another, and before long, it changes the atmosphere of entire places, entire relationships, entire lives. Before we talk about the moral directly, think about this. Everyone in that restaurant walked in expecting an ordinary night. They expected good food, polite service, and maybe a little luxury. But they left with something they didn't expect, a lesson that no menu could offer. A lesson about humility, about patience, about grace. A plate shattered, but something else was built in its place, understanding. Before we talk about your place in that lesson, ask yourself, how do you react when someone makes a mistake around you? Do you let frustration take the lead, or do you pause long enough to remember that you've stumbled too? Compassion doesn't mean ignoring responsibility. It means recognizing humanity before judgment. It means understanding that mistakes don't define people. Responses do. The billionaire's wealth didn't make his reaction noble. His empathy did. And that's something anyone, anywhere, can choose. Whether you're a boss, a student, a parent, or a stranger on a crowded street, kindness is always within reach. Before we talk about what the story teaches, we should realize that it's not about perfection. No one is kind all the time. Everyone fails, everyone snaps, everyone forgets. But the point isn't to never fall short, it's to remember when we can, to reach for compassion instead of judgment. Because even one moment of grace can undo 1,000 moments of pain. A moment of kindness can heal unseen wounds. That night proved it. The billionaire didn't just forgive a mistake, he unknowingly healed a part of himself and gave hope to everyone watching. Before we talk about what you might take from this, picture the next time you're in a similar situation. When someone spills coffee, misses a deadline, or says the wrong thing, that will be your chance to do what he did, to choose calm over anger, to choose empathy over ego. You might never know how much it means. You might never see the impact. But kindness doesn't need witnesses to matter, doesn't fade. It leaves echoes in places you'll never see. Before we talk about moving on, remember that life gives us countless small tests every day. Most of them are invisible. A rude comment, a delay, a clumsy mistake. These are all invitations, quiet chances to prove what kind of person we are. And each time we choose patience, we build something stronger inside ourselves, a character that isn't shaken by the world's noise. So maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the billionaire, not the waitress, but the reminder that kindness is our most enduring currency, one that never loses value no matter how much or little we have. Before we talk about the end of the night, imagine that quiet restaurant again. The lights still glowed. The broken plate was cleaned up. The guests finished their meals, but something invisible had changed. Everyone breathed a little deeper, spoke a little softer. The air felt lighter. That's what compassion does. It restores balance in places where pride once ruled. It softens hearts without anyone realizing it. It heals wounds no one else can see. And maybe that's the real takeaway. The next time you see someone stumble, whether it's a spilled plate or a moment of weakness, pause before you judge, because you might be looking at a reflection of yourself, just in a different moment of life. And choosing kindness could be the thing that saves not only them, but a forgotten part of you too. Before we end this story, take a moment to think, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have reacted with anger or with the same quiet compassion that Billionaire showed that night? Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest hearts. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of kindness today. Never know who's fighting a silent battle behind their smile. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen or experienced a moment like this? Your story might inspire someone else. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful real-life stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Because just like that night in the restaurant, a single act of kindness can change more than a moment. It can change a heart.